All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really, truly fascinating parallel. We're going to look at how the biological cultivation of the wild rose, taming it from this rugged ancient survivor into a delicate, ornamental bloom, historically mirrors the strict social engineering of Victorian womanhood. It's an incredible story of nature, human control, and the hidden complexities that resist being perfectly pruned.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the deep roots of the rose, cultivating the queen, the moment the modern hybrid emerges, the aesthetics of the feminine, and finally, beyond the aesthetic.
All right, Section 1. Deep Roots of the Rose. 30 million years of evolution. Long before we ever arrived on the scene to cultivate, engineer, or frankly even admire it, the rose family, the Rosaceae family, had this incredibly rich, highly adaptable history all of its own. I mean, fossil records actually reveal that the predecessors to today's delicate Valentine's roses were out there thriving across multiple continents tens of millions of years ago. We're talking 30 million years ago. The earliest fossils are scattered across Europe, Asia, and North America, right through to this massive proliferation during the Middle Eocene epoch in places like the Okanagan Highlands. And we actually have perfectly preserved visual evidence of this. Fossilized Spirea and Prunus flowers. These are ancient relatives in the rose family from the Eocene epoch. Now, you'll notice they weren't the showy, multi-petaled, hyper-engineered blooms that we're so used to seeing today. Not at all. They were practical, wild, and built for one thing: survival and reproduction.
Even the early foliage really highlights these morphological adaptations. The sheer diversity of these ancient leaves shows just how robust and, well, earthy these early plants really were. They were absolute survivors. They were constantly adapting to shifting climates and rugged terrains, just carving out their place in a totally wild, uncurated ancient ecosystem.
So how did they survive those wild habitats? Well, the rose family relied on some pretty incredible evolutionary drivers. Things like agammospermy, which is essentially producing seeds without fertilization, along with biological hybridization and polyploidy, which is just a fancy way of saying the doubling of chromosomes. Basically, to put it simply, they were genetic shapeshifters. They were constantly mixing, matching, and mutating their genetic material to generate novel combinations. They were inherently wild, wonderfully complex, and actively changing just to stay alive.
Moving on to Section 2, Cultivating the Queen, Human History with the Rose.
Now, the cultural engineering of this wild plant started thousands of years ago, right when humanity stepped in to tame and elevate it, purely for its aesthetic value. As early as 600 BC, the Greek poet Sappho boldly declared the rose the undeniable queen of flowers in her famous ode. And that label stuck. It effectively cemented the flower's cultural dominance in the Western world. It was no longer just a surviving plant out in the wild, it was elevated into this massive symbol, an absolute aesthetic ideal of beauty.
And let me tell you, this aesthetic ideal absolutely consumed the Roman Empire. They were completely, totally obsessed. I mean, they carpeted their floors with petals, they filled their bathwater with them, dropped them from the ceiling as ancient party confetti, and even ate them. They also hung roses from ceilings during civic meetings to symbolize secrecy. They were quite literally integrating a flower into their most intimate social and behavioral codes.
Meanwhile, over in China, the meticulous structural engineering of the rose was taking place over millennia. Starting from wild roses about 2,000 years ago, cultivators achieved this massive breakthrough around 1,000 years ago, the perpetual or repeat blooming rose. This wasn't an accident. It was a total masterpiece of deliberate botanical manipulation spanning generations.
Back over in Europe, this horticultural obsession really culminated with Empress Josephine of France. By 1814, she had cultivated an astounding 250 species and varieties of roses at her estate at Malmaison. Think about that. She essentially collected every single variety known to humanity at the time, curating this perfectly controlled, entirely manufactured natural aesthetic right in her own backyard.
All right, Section 3, The Modern Hybrid Emerges. Engineering the Perfect Bloom.
So this relentless desire for botanical perfection reached a dramatic tipping point in the late 18th century. You had these European roses, right? Highly prized, sure, but they only bloomed for just a short window once a year. But then, Asian species like Rosa chinensis were introduced to Europe, and they were game changers. They brought the ability to bloom repeatedly and introduced entirely new colors, like yellow. Horticulturists immediately saw this huge opportunity to forcibly crossbreed these separate lineages.
And this deliberate botanical engineering gave birth to the modern hybrid tea rose. It quickly became the global standard.
Exactly the kind of rose you'd buy on Valentine's Day. It represents this absolute aesthetic triumph of human intervention over nature. That wild, adaptable, ancient plant we saw in the fossil record, it was heavily pruned, selected, and bred into a perfectly curated, passive object, designed purely to look beautiful on command.
Which brings us to Section 4, Aesthetics of the Feminine, the 19th Century Ideal.
Now, right as horticulturists were perfecting that physical garden rose, 19th century Victorian society was busy engineering something else, the ideal woman. I found this fascinating parallel in an academic analysis by Alison Fiona Chapman from the University of Glasgow. Her work looks deeply into the poet Christina Rossetti and explores how Victorian society attempted to prune and shape women's identities, much like those prize-winning garden roses.
During this era, women were subjected to what's called the aesthetic of the feminine. It was this incredibly rigid gender ideology that equated ideal womanhood strictly with passivity, ethereality, and the non-material. So just as the wild rose was stripped of its messy, robust nature to become a delicate, fragile bloom, women were heavily policed and forced into a perfectly curated, submissive standard.
You can actually see this policing in practice through critics at the time, like Paul Elmer Moore. He celebrated Christina Rossetti's poetry by praising her utter womanliness, her feminine mind, and her feminine heart. He was effectively rewarding her for appearing to stay beautifully and quietly confined within this passive societal garden.
But this system was a double-edged sword. While Moore praised Rossetti, he simultaneously punished another brilliant poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And why? Well, because Browning dared to step outside of that aesthetic garden. She was castigated for her quote-unquote masculine political ideas, her passion for reform, and her scholarship. Society acted like this harsh, unforgiving gardener, aggressively clipping away anyone who grew outside the acceptable, passive boundaries of the feminine.
And finally, Section 5, Beyond the Aesthetic, Evading the Rigid System.
Because at the end of the day, neither nature nor the human spirit is ever entirely subdued, right? Just like that ancient, resilient wild rose, Rossetti's identity was ungovernable. Her poetry subtly resisted this intense aesthetic policing. She used contemporary movements like Tractarianism and Pre-Raphaelitism, movements that heavily utilized deep, hidden symbolism to essentially mask her true meanings. She carefully oscillated between silence and speech, presence and absence, cleverly evading the rigid representational system of her era. So she appeared as the perfect societal bloom on the outside, while retaining all of her complex, unpruned nature underneath. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question, something to really chew on. Whether it's the flowers in our gardens, carefully crossbred for the exact perfect petal count, or the gender roles in our society, why are we so incredibly driven to engineer the perfect aesthetic? How much are we still projecting our own impossible ideals onto nature and the people around us today? It's definitely something to think about the next time you look at a perfectly cultivated rose. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.